Some Republicans have looked at this plan and said if you increase the corporate tax rate overall, in the long run, jobs could be eliminated. They cite one study, the Tax Foundation, that says that increasing the corporate tax rate will eliminate 159,000 jobs over the next 10 to 30 years. How do you respond to that criticism that in the long run, this plan kills jobs?
I don't agree with that assessment. So a few points. With respect to taxes, there is not a shred of evidence to show that the cuts in 2017 increased growth or productivity. Actually, very little of it went into additional R&D. Let's give it a shot. Let's go big. I can tell you this, every single business leader I've talked to applauds the fact that this package is more than just roads, bridges, and water.
Can you just clarify what your position is on whether TikTok needs to be sold by the Chinese company ByteDance that owns it now? And can you also give us a broad view of your advice to President Biden on tariffs with regard to China?
I would say here's my broad view, and I don't want to get into details on any particular company. My broad view is what we do on offense is more important than what we do on defense. To compete in the long run with China, we need to rebuild America in all of the ways we're talking about today. And by the way, do that with our allies. We have to work with our allies and find common ground where we can. With respect to tariffs, there is a place for tariffs. The 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum have, in fact, helped save American jobs in the steel and aluminum industries. So what do we do with tariffs? We have to level the playing field. No one can outcompete the American worker if the playing field is level. And the fact is China's actions are uncompetitive, coercive, underhanded. They've proven they'll do whatever it takes. And so I plan to use all the tools in my toolbox as aggressively as possible to protect American workers and businesses from unfair Chinese practices. We know that lack of investment, particularly in public transportation, transit, water, housing, has hurt low-income folks and people of color the most. And it's time to finally rectify that systemic inequality and build back better and more equally. As Jen said, my job as a Commerce Secretary is to do everything I can to enable American businesses of all sizes to compete. And at its core, the American Jobs Plan is about investing in American competitiveness, strengthening our workforce, rebuilding infrastructure, and leveling the playing field so all Americans have a shot at a good job. Now, prior to being Commerce Secretary, I was governor for 6 years. Prior to that, I was in the private sector. And so over the course of my career as an entrepreneur, as governor, now as Commerce Secretary, I have had many discussions with businesses, from the biggest to the smallest. And over the years, there is something that we all seem to agree on, which is that we need to make massive investments in our infrastructure if we are going to compete and ensure America's global competitiveness. And most recently, I have spent a lot of time in the past few weeks talking to business leaders, and I can report to you that there's a broad level of enthusiasm for big investments in infrastructure. And I think there is a recognition that President Biden is doing the right thing in pushing us to conceive of infrastructure as broad, as including investments in STEM, research and development, investments in basic research, investments in broadband, investments in training our workforce. And the truth of it is, that's what it's going to take to compete. A key component of the American Jobs Plan is training our workforce. This is a reality. The changes in the American economy, many of which have been massively accelerated by COVID, are very scary for millions of Americans. It's a scary place to be, to need a job and not have the skills to get a good job. And so that's why this package calls for big investments in training our workforce. Now, as Jen said, this was a priority of mine when I was governor, and I saw it work. I know it works. We saw it work. When I ran for governor, my state, Rhode Island, if you haven't been, I want you to go. had the highest unemployment rate in the country, #1 in America. It was sad, very sad. The unemployment rate in the building trades when I took over was over 20%. Think about what that does to a community. Before COVID, after a lot of our work, Rhode Island had more jobs than at any time in our state's history. Because we leaned into it in a broad fashion, similar to what this package calls for. Investments in infrastructure, working with business, and big investments in worker training. So the fact of the matter is, in order to compete, we have to have investments in apprenticeships, community colleges, STEM education, job training. My view is, if you have the guts in the middle of your career to go out and get some job training, to retrain yourself to get a new job, then we need to be there for you to provide high-quality, demand-driven, affordable, if not free, job training. The American Jobs Plan also is about strengthening our supply chains, making things in America, making critical goods in America, creating good jobs in the process, and increasing the security that we have, knowing that we aren't overly dependent on other countries for critical supplies. We saw that on full display in COVID. Every governor knows what it's like to be up in the middle of the night, can't get your hands on PPE or ventilators or medicine because they aren't manufactured in America. We also need to invest in domestic manufacturing, particularly for critical industries like semiconductors. We all know semiconductors are the building blocks of our future economy. And as we go through the data and digital revolution, semiconductors underpin so much of the new technology where we'll see job creation. So we are living through now a global chip shortage. We're seeing that hurt businesses in every sector, and so we need to strengthen our domestic supply chains. The American Jobs Plan calls for a $50 billion investment in semiconductor manufacturing and research, as is called for in the Bipartisan CHIPS Act. Finally, we need strong investments in our broadband infrastructure. We've seen more clearly than ever before that high-quality, affordable broadband isn't a luxury, but it's a necessity for education, jobs, and healthcare. But millions and millions of Americans don't have access to broadband, particularly in rural communities. I finally want to address one last component, which is the investments in the care economy. You might say to yourself, why is the Commerce Secretary talking about investments in the care economy? Because it matters. It is core to our competitiveness. In order for you to be able to go to work, you need to know that your loved one is being taken care of. And also, we have millions and millions of women, mostly women of color, working full-time, caring for our loved ones, living in poverty. It's time to make those investments so they can have a dignified job and so that we can shore up our communities. As Jen said, I did a lot of work of this as governor, and it's something that I'm very proud of President Biden and to be on the team of a president who's investing in the care economy. So fundamentally, this plan invests in American workers and businesses, small and large alike, so they can compete and win in the global marketplace. And I'm psyched to talk to you about it and proud to be on the team that's going to get this done.
All right, Kristen.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Secretary Raimondo, for being here. As you know, some Republicans have looked at this plan and said if you increase the corporate tax rate overall, in the long run, jobs could be eliminated. They cite one study, the Tax Foundation, that says that increasing the corporate tax rate will eliminate 159,000 jobs over the next 10 to 30 years. How do you respond to that criticism that in the long run, this plan kills jobs?
I don't agree with that assessment. So a few points. First of all, every business leader I talk to, big and small, agrees we must make these investments in infrastructure in order to compete. If we don't invest in semiconductors, we're going to fall further behind. If we don't invest in job training, we're not going to have the workforce that businesses need to compete. So it's essential that we make these investments. With respect to taxes, there is not a shred of evidence to show that the cuts in 2017 increased growth or productivity. Actually, very little of it went into additional R&D. So the fact of the matter is the corporate structure today is broken. Many companies don't, large profitable companies pay no corporate taxes. So I'd like to think we can all agree that it needs to be improved. level the playing field, close the loopholes, and have a discussion around how we do this together to improve competitiveness.
If it is raised to 28%, though, that would put the U.S. at one of the highest in the world. Does it have to be 28%? Would you go lower? Could you accomplish the same thing if the tax rate weren't raised to 28%?
So there is room for compromise. That is clear. The president has said a few things. We have to get this investment done. He's charged us to work across the aisle and in a bipartisan way, and we need to pay for what we're doing. Like, our proposal is to invest in 8 years and pay back over 15. Now, we can have a discussion about that. Should we pay it back over 20 instead of 15? Is the rate not quite 28? Is it something, lower? So we want a compromise. What we cannot do, and what I am imploring the business community not to do, is to say, we don't like 28, we're walking away, we're not discussing. That's unacceptable. Come to the table and problem solve with us to come up with a reasonable, responsible plan.
Mario.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. 2 questions for you. On the infrastructure side, how do you target and make sure that those projects help minority communities? I'm thinking of the situation in Jackson, Mississippi, for example, Flint as well. And then my other question is, how do you make sure that minorities are the beneficiaries of these jobs, right? There's been a long history of programs that were built to help minorities. I'm thinking of opportunity zones with the last administration that didn't ultimately help minorities.
Yeah, really good question. 2 things. So, again, the president's been very clear in this. This is about equity in everything we do. And I can promise you, as Commerce Secretary, like right now we have $3 billion from the rescue package to invest in communities. I promise you now, equity is front and center. And that's why I was saying we have to get the money everywhere, rural, tribal, urban, and prioritizing those who have been left behind. With respect to the job training, I can fall on my own experience. We did a Back to Work Rhode Island job training initiative, and we said we're going to make sure it's equitable. More than half of the people trained were women. More than 25% were people of color. If you commit yourself to it, which is what we will do under the president's leadership, we will make sure to make up for the fact that, as you say, in the past that hasn't been done.
Alex.
Thank you. What is the status and direction of the China tech policy review? And more specifically, what about TikTok?
Yeah. So I'll say quickly, we need to play offense and defense. The jobs package is offense. Invest in America, competitiveness, so we can play offense. A lot of the tools that Commerce has are defense. The entities list, tariffs, et cetera. So we are, led by Jake Sullivan and our team, Interagency Review. We're in the process of doing it now. A lot of people have said, is Huawei going to stay on the entity list? I have no reason to believe that they won't, but we're kind of in the middle of the overall review of China policy.
How close is that to being?
I would actually defer that more to the White House, but I would say we're in the thick of it right now. Like, we're working as aggressively as we can. We're not wasting time on it.
Thank you, Secretary. I'm hoping to draw on your experience as governor regarding the virus. The White House and the president have been calling on governors across the country not to roll back virus restrictions, business capacity limitations, and the like. Yet many, including many Democratic governors, have rolled back those policies steadily, even as cases have risen. You face some of these struggles as governor. Can you speak to a little bit what those governors are facing, and how would you advise them to balance their, maybe the pressures at home versus the federal guidance here to keep those restrictions in place?
So it's a tough spot. To be a governor in America today is a challenge, and everyone's trying hard. I would say, first of all, they are so lucky that President Biden is in office now after what we lived through last year. Secondly, follow the president's lead around vaccinations. The administration is doing a fantastic job getting vaccinations out the door. And I think that it's a balance. Listen, every governor knows what's going on in their community, and I think we have to respect that. They see what's going on in their community. Having said that, I would say, the Biden administration is focused heavily on vaccinations and has a fantastic strategy. And I would just encourage governors to lean into that, vaccinate people as quickly as possible, and don't jump the gun. I am not going to tell governors what to do. I just have lived it, and every time you jump the gun, you live to regret it. So vaccinate. Put the pedal to the metal on vaccinating more than lifting restrictions.
Ed?
Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. You oversee a big department, everything from the Weather Service to the fisheries and the census. Have you been briefed on the status of getting the results of the 2020 census?
Yes, I have.
When's it coming?
Well, we have said that the redistricting data will be available no later than September 30th. If it's available before that, and we feel comfortable about it, we'll put it out then. But we need a little bit more time.
Do state elections officials, secretaries of state, who are sitting there, scratching their head over which lines they should be using for elections this year and next year, what do you say to them?
I say, I know it's tough, but be patient. Last year was a once in a lifetime pandemic. The census professionals had to do the census in the middle of a global pandemic with COVID, civil unrest through the summer. So we're behind. We are behind. But my direction to the team is we have to get it right. So having been a local politician, I hear them. But the fact of the matter is, it is so much better to wait a little longer and have accurate data that we all can trust. So I rest assured, if it's ready before the 30th, we'll put it out. But we are prioritizing accuracy over rushing it out.
There's one wonky bit of this, though, and it's the subject of lawsuits, differential privacy, or the idea of using essentially funky math to sort out some of this. Have you been briefed on that, and do you think that was a good idea at this point to have done it that way? Would you recommend doing it that way in the future?
So in this regard, I have to rely on the experts. The experts at the Census Bureau are top-notch, career top-notch statisticians and demographers. Here's the reality. What you're referring to is a statistical technique that is intended to protect people's privacy. It's the first time we've used it. Today, the way quantum computing is such that there can be privacy hacks today that weren't technologically available 10 years ago. So in order for us to keep up with that and protect people's privacy, we have to implement new techniques, and this is one of those new techniques. So yes, I think it's justified.
Let's see, you gotta be the last one. Thanks.
But
We'll invite her back.
Thanks, Madam Secretary. Two quick ones on infrastructure for you. A friend of this White House, Senator Coons, said today that he thinks it's more likely that Democrats ultimately will end up with a less robust, his words, infrastructure package. He says could end up looking at one that's more directly targeted at what he's calling hard infrastructure. Is that an accurate prediction to you at this stage? And then my second question, I'll just tack it on here. The president, you're one of the 5 cabinet secretaries that President Biden tapped to kind of go out and sell this, his words, to engage the public. What does that entail at this point, specifically as it relates to getting these Republicans on board with this plan?
Talking to them, sitting down, listening, engaging them. As I said before, we have put forth a bold proposal and a reasonable way to pay for it. There are other ideas. So what I'm going to do, and all the cabinet is doing it in the White House, is sitting down with our Republicans, friends, and Democrats, and business leaders, and saying, okay, if you don't like this, what's your idea? How do you think we ought to pay for it? If we are proposing paying for it over 15 years. What do you think? So I think, again, it's all about finding that compromise and actually delivering for the American people. So that, anyway, I think broad engagement.
Face-to-face conversations with?
If you include Zoom as face-to-face, I would say very many. Only a few actually face-to-face, but a lot, a lot. And I plan to do even more of it. We're serious about this. We want to get this done. There's a lot of different ways to do it. The president does what a leader does, puts forth his ideas. Now let's get to work. Let's talk about it. Where do we tweak it? Where do we change it? With respect to Senator Coons, I am not going to disagree with his assessment because he's been up here longer than my 4 weeks. But, look, I think it's early to say. The president put his plan out a week ago. Let's give it a shot. Let's go big. I can tell you this, every single business leader I've talked to applauds the fact that this package is more than just roads, bridges, and water. Like, come on, 35% of Americans in rural areas don't have broadband. You cannot have a modern economy without that. We have a crisis in semiconductor manufacturing. You cannot have a modern economy without that. So I hope that that isn't where we settle, because we'd be shortchanging American people, workers, and businesses.
All right, Jeff, you're so convincing.
Thank you. Secretary, just to follow up on Alex's question about TikTok. Can you just clarify what your position is on whether TikTok needs to be sold by the Chinese company ByteDance that owns it now? And can you also give us a broad view of your advice to President Biden on tariffs with regard to China?
I would say here's my broad view, and I don't want to get into details on any particular company. My broad view is what we do on offense is more important than what we do on defense. To compete in the long run with China, we need to rebuild America in all of the ways we're talking about today. And by the way, do that with our allies. You know, we have to work with our allies and find common ground where we can. With respect to tariffs, there is a place for tariffs. You know, the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum have, in fact, helped save American jobs in the steel and aluminum industries. So what do we do with tariffs? We have to level the playing field. No one can outcompete the American worker if the playing field is level. And the fact is China's actions are uncompetitive, coercive, underhanded. They've proven they'll do whatever it takes. And so I plan to use all the tools in my toolbox as aggressively as possible to protect American workers and businesses from unfair Chinese practices.
Yumish, I don't want to leave you hanging, and you're the last one hanging.
At
the risk, Yumish.
Well, this is great. Thank you, Madam
Hopefully
Secretary.
the secretary will come back after this. Go ahead.
It depends what she asks.
Yeah.
Right, now it's a lot of pressure. But thank you for taking my question, Madam Secretary. What do you say to a business owner who's looking at the U.S. and wondering, why should I start a company here when I could possibly do so in another country more cheaply? How do we stay competitive as the United States for that business owner's company?
So I'd say a few things. One, you cannot get better than American workers, American ingenuity, American innovation. Two, this jobs plan will enhance American competitiveness. You know, I know from being governor, businesses want to locate in communities with good infrastructure, good public transportation, clean water, excellent public schools. That's where businesses want to be. That's where their employees want to work. So if we pass this package, it will massively, businesses will want to be here, will want to be here more than they do now. Also, the whole point of the tax reform as proposed by the administration is to get rid of the loopholes, level the playing field between big businesses and small businesses. I don't know any small businesses in Rhode Island who are shielding their profits in tax havens around the world. Like, it'll level the playing field, raise more money, and allow us to invest in job-creating infrastructure and job training. So as a former business owner and as a former governor who recruited businesses, I think it's a winner for business.
Is there an alternative other than the 28%? It sounds like
Yes.
it's a little open. What else could the White House come up with to pay for the infrastructure?
Let's have the discussion. Let us have the discussion. We put a plan out. Tell us what you think is an alternative, reasonable plan. But I would say, don't shortchange America. Don't come back and say we only need $500 million of infrastructure, because we don't. Because if we do that, we'll be in the same place or a worse place 10 years from now. So, yes, we're wide open. Reasonable people can disagree. We'll find compromise. But let's go big and let's do what's required.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.